Today we're looking at My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Now the poem itself is quite long and it's quite dense. There's no separate stanzas there, it's all in one long stream. And so it can look quite daunting as a poem. It's one of the longest in the anthology, along with perhaps the prelude. But where the prelude is full of sort of shorter lines and quite easily distinguishable between two different sections, My Last Duchess seems to be one of the harder ones for students in the anthology because the story itself is quite complicated and because there's very little break within the poem. So what we're going to do in part one is really talk about the story of the poem, the background, the context of the poem, who the characters are, and we'll look at the first couple of lines and the establishment of a particular tone. Okay, so let's first of all think about who this poem is about. And you'll notice at the top of the poem it actually has the word Ferrara in italics, and that is to signify that Ferrara, the Duke of Ferrara, is the man, the character who is speaking. This is from his perspective. Now, the Duke of Ferrara in question is a man called Alfonso II. And he ruled the city-state of Ferrara in Italy in the 16th century. Now, back in the 16th century, until relatively recently actually, Italy was separated into different city-states. You might have read Romeo and Juliet and the city-state of Verona. So each city had its own royal family, its own governor, its own head of monarchy. And in this case, Ferrara was run by the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso II. Now those titles went down from father to son through generations, and the Duke of Ferrara was an exceptionally ancient title with nearly 1,000 years of history, and so it had been passed down through the family until Alfonso II, much like a royal family passes down. They were effectively monarchies like that. You've also got to remember at that time that Italy was governed by a patriarchy, the rule of men. So it went to older sons unless there were no male heirs, but also it was governed by a rule where men were the head of the household, right down from the monarchy to the merest peasants. The men were more important than the women. And what happened was that the men, and again, if you've watched Romeo and Juliet, or if you've studied Romeo and Juliet, similar sort of idea really in terms of arranged marriage. The men would arrange the marriages as a way to increase status and hierarchy and bring well-known, well-brought-up, well-bred families together. And his previous Duchess, the My Last Duchess of the title, was Lucrezia de' Medici. Now the de' Medicis were a very famous family around Florence, and the Duke of Ferrara would have organised to bring his and the de' Medici family together through representatives. He would have not spoken to Lucrezia herself and would have organised the wedding and the financial agreement between the families with some of the elder men from the family. Okay, now rumour had it that Lucrezia de' Medici was poisoned by the Duke of Ferrara and killed in mysterious circumstances, and that's what this poem is about. It's about the Duke of Ferrara getting off his chest everything that was wrong with Lucrezia. He never mentions her by name, and actually that's exceptionally important in the poem that he doesn't mention her by name. She's not important to him now. She's not at all interesting to him. He just wants to move on. And actually the people he's speaking to, or the person he's speaking to, is a representative of his next wife. So he wants to organise another wedding to bring together another rich family, presumably, into his, to increase his status even further. And so actually he's talking about all the problems he had with Lucrezia as a warning to this next family, that he's not going to put up with any nonsense. He's not going to put up with any disloyalty as he sees it. He's not going to put up with any behaviour that he thinks detracts from his next Duchess's love for him. And this is the story of Lucrezia. And the story was that he'd had this painting done, and he mentions the name of the painter several times through the poem, Fra Pandolf. He tries to impress that he's got Fra Pandolf, the painter, to come and paint Lucrezia. That in itself is a status symbol for him, that he's got this famous painter to come and paint Lucrezia. And the first sign of trouble was that maybe his last Duchess, Lucrezia, was smiling and blushing slightly in the picture. And he starts to wonder, why was she smiling? Why was she blushing? Perhaps she was complimented by the artist. Perhaps he happened to say how lovely she looked, and she blushed and smiled. The Duke doesn't like this. He doesn't like the fact that she's being complimented by another man. He doesn't like the fact that she accepts those compliments from another man. And he moves on to other problems that he had. Now, Lucrezia seems like a particularly lovely young lady because she has thanked lots of people and was joyful for lots of things. And in the middle of the poem, she's joyful for the sunrise. She's joyful for riding around the orchard on a particularly nice mule. She's thankful for somebody who brought her some cherries. So this we would think would be a particularly good thing, but no, not for the Duke. He doesn't think that she should be overly thankful to anyone else. The only thing that she should be thankful for is that she is his Duchess, that he's given her that title. A Duchess, of course, comes from the person who marries the Duke. So he has given her that title. And that's what's important to him. He's given her this 900 years old name, and she should be grateful for that and nothing else. Now, the other thing that really gets on his nerves is the fact that Lucrezia smiled at other men. Now, he doesn't mind that she smiled, but actually she should have only really been smiling at him, and who passed without the same smiles. So he's a little bit jealous, he's extremely controlling, and he doesn't like the fact that Lucrezia treats everybody equally. He feels that only he should be the centre of her affection. Only he should receive her thanks and gratitude for what he's done for her, taking her from nothing, although she wasn't nothing, to the Duchess of Ferrara. And then towards the end, we get the hint that he's killed her. Remember, these are only rumours. This was historical rumours that he had poisoned Lucrezia. It was never proven. But he talks about how this grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Now, he never says that she's killed, but we know that he's given commands and that all the smiling has stopped. And at the beginning of the poem, we know that she's dead. And the whole monologue tells us that she must be dead because he's arranging his next marriage. He's careful enough not to implicate himself, not to admit that he's killed her, but the hints are there. And by the end of the poem, he's boastful once again because he takes the representative of the next woman that he wants to marry, he takes him downstairs and shows him another piece of art. And the piece of art he shows at the end is a metaphor for the control that he wants to have. So let's just consider the story again in a nutshell. It's a monologue, which means a long speech spoken by one person. It's spoken by the Duke of Ferrara to the representative of someone he wants to marry now. And the story he tells to that person is of his last Duchess, who smiled too much, was too grateful, didn't give him the gratitude that he felt he should have, and so he probably had her killed. Okay, let's read the whole poem through. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now, for our Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth of passion and its earnest grey glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. And seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there, so not the first of you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, "Her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much," or "Paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat." Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Search was all one, my favourite her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her. But who passed without such a smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Will please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. Though his daughter's first self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Okay, it's quite daunting. What we need to do, as with all poems, is pick out the bits that really, really count. You know the story now. You need to know a few quotes throughout, and instead of focusing on real details, in the next two parts I'll pick out just a few key quotes that you're going to need to know, that you need to know a little bit about, that you can write a lot about. We'll start though with today's key quote, the first part. That's my Last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. This sets the tone for the whole poem. Remember the story, remember who he's speaking to, the representative of a new Duchess, but he wants to prove a point. He takes this man to his last Duchess and he points her out as an example, as a warning. Notice this, looking as if she were alive. It's a warning. If this next Duchess also behaves like she did, she too will end up as merely a painting and not as someone still living. It's a sinister tone. And the Duke of Ferrara is a sinister character. He speaks so much through this, so dismissively about his last Duchess, and that sinister tone, looking as if she were alive. He repeats this a little bit later on. There she stands as if alive on line 46 and 47. So he keeps coming back to the point, making the point subtly that she is dead. Now we know that she is, but he's got to repeat that point because it's a warning. Notice the pronoun my, that sense of ownership that he has. Okay, so revise the story, make sure you know the story, think about the setting of this tone initially, this sinister warning tone that the Duke sets, and then we'll look at some more specific language a bit later on.